Welcome back to HC Daily. Today we have a very special guest with us, the inimitable Wesley Woods. And we're so excited. We're going to begin a brand new series on the book of Daniel. We're going to spend the next 5 days or so talking about Daniel. And this is a really incredible story about thriving in a really godless culture and society. So that's what we're talking about today on HC Daily.
You're listening to another episode of HC Daily, a daily devotional podcast that you can listen to at home or on the go. We believe that you can grow as much as you want to grow spiritually, and this podcast can be a part of your daily growth plan. So, whether you're watching on YouTube, listening on Spotify or your favorite podcast app, we're glad you're here. Now, let's join our hosts, Jeff Forrester and Chris Zarbaugh, in the studio.
So Wesley, normally at this time slot, Chris Zarbaugh is sitting in your seat, and we have the incredible privilege of discovering all the amazing things in his life by asking really penetrating questions. But I guess the most controversial question that we asked him is the first one I want to ask you.
Oh, so great.
Yeah. So I had said in one of the interview questions, I said, in the inevitable movie that's made of your life, who do you want to play Chris Zarbaugh, right? So I'm going to ask you the same question because we were all shocked by his answer. I'm going to ask you the same question. When the movie's made of your life, who do you want to play Wesley Woods?
Oh, that's a tough one. There's so many great actors. I would say Denzel Washington.
Denzel, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, so Denzel. Morgan Freeman's a great actor.
He's got a great voice.
I would say Anthony Hopkins, but some people might say, I don't know. It could work. I don't know. It could work.
Is Silence of the Lambs Anthony Hopkins? Because that's a little scary.
But he's a good actor. He's a good actor.
People go, yeah, I see the similarities. Okay. Well, hey, that's way better than Zac Efron. All three of those are, so whatever. Well,
oh, man.
That's great. I'm so glad I asked that question. Yeah, it really lets us know. For those of you that are new to the podcast or maybe don't know Wesley, Wesley works with us at Heritage Church. He's an associate pastor and just a great team member. And I say all the time, Wesley is the most trusted staff member at Heritage Church, the church we work at. So if you don't trust me and you don't trust Chris, go ask Wesley. He'll shoot straight with you. So as I mentioned, we're starting off in the book of Daniel. And Chris and I, as we were trying to figure out what we were going to do after we finished up Solomon, we were tempted to just keep going. Because at the end of Solomon, to give you some context, at the end of Solomon's life, Solomon had walked away from God, and God said, okay, I'm going to take most of the kingdom. I'm just going to leave Judah in your family's lineage, in their rule, and then the northern portion of the kingdom is going to go a different way. Yeah. Well, then, for the next 360 years, it's up and down, up and down, up and down. Judah honors God, and Israel rebels against God. Then Israel honors God, and Judah rebels against God. And they just get good kings and bad kings over and over and over again. During that time, there are several key characters. So to kind of put things in perspective for people, Solomon was made king in 970 BC. 970 BC. That's way before Socrates and Aristotle and Plato and all them, right? Yeah. It was even before the first Greek games, right? First Olympics. So there's that. And then after Solomon, 970, from there, you have Elijah and Elisha and Ahab. You have a whole bunch of kings. You have Hezekiah. You have let me see. I've got a couple of these written down here. I have this little timeline here. Hezekiah becomes king. Jeremiah winds up becoming this great prophet. You have Daniel is also, not Daniel, Jonah also is a prophet during this time. So these are some really significant characters. But we felt like the pattern was the same as everything we talked from Judges, which is hot, cold, into David's life, Samuel's life, David's life, Solomon's life. It's the same pattern. So we decided just to kind of leapfrog to Daniel.
Yeah, and we see that pattern a lot even throughout the Old Testament.
Yeah.
When you search through, you look at David's life in Psalms, it's literally like that. In one chapter, he's talking about how great God is and the blessings God bestowed upon him. The next chapter, he's literally saying something to the effect, let the birds pick at my scabs, you know.
Yeah.
So and what I love about that is I feel that the average person can relate to that.
Yes.
The person listening to us right now, everything in your life may not be roses and everything right now may not be great. And we do have hills and valleys in our life. But a common thread that you see throughout the Old Testament is the fact that it's pointing towards an answer.
Yeah.
It's pointing towards Christ in the New Testament.
Right, and the whole pattern from Judges all the way through to Solomon and even up now to Daniel's thing is when they honor God, they see blessing and prosperity. When they walk away as a nation from God, then God warns them through the different prophets. And then after
they often don't listen.
They don't listen, and then consequences come.
Yeah.
And then they're all like, oh, we're so miserable. Why did God do this to us? And
Yeah.
God's like, I didn't do this to you. I warned you, and you did it.
And we do the same thing.
This is the same pattern.
That's why I said people can relate to this.
Yes.
We do the same thing. God, why did you let that happen to me?
Yeah.
I didn't let anything happen to you. Maybe it was the decisions you made that got you into this situation. Not in all cases, but in some cases, that's the reason.
As we read through the Old Testament, the Bible says a couple different times that the Old Testament is for our example.
Yeah.
The reason why God told us these stories, because these stories, unless you're Jewish, these aren't part of your history.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons he gave us these stories is for our own example, for us to learn from.
Yeah.
And the main thing I think to learn from the Old Testament is just because you have a high spiritual moment does not mean that one high spiritual moment is going to carry through for the whole rest of your life.
Yeah.
Right? You have to continue pursuing God and relationship with God. Otherwise, the natural inclination of humanity is to go against him.
So
Right?
I'm going to throw a curveball at you, Jeff. So does that mean I can't just go to church once?
Oh, yeah.
Or pray
Just
once,
once, right.
and expect that moment to carry me through for months?
Right. Well, you can't just eat one meal.
Yeah.
Right? I could eat fewer meals probably and do okay. But you can't just eat one meal. Eventually, you're going to die. And it's the same kind of thing. So anyways, here you are now. So 970 BC is when Solomon became king. He died, sometime right around 900 BC. And then just a little after or before, whatever. And then now here with Daniel, we are at 605 BC. So 300 and some odd years, 365 years between. And at this point, 605 BC, Daniel's probably somewhere around 15 years old. And so with that being said, let's just start right off in the book of Daniel, chapter 1, and we'll just take chapter by chapter over the next few days. Is that cool?
Yeah, that sounds good.
So here's what it says. We're reading from the New Living Translation. It says, during the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. That's a shocking moment, right?
Yeah.
Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning. They're gifted in knowledge and good judgment and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar, Hananiah was called Shadrach, Mishael was called Meshach, Azariah was called Abednego. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Now, God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. But he responded, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded. And Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food, and then make your decision in light of what you see. The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who'd been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others. God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom, and God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meaning of visions and dreams. When the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. Whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. And Daniel remained in the royal service until the first year of the reign of King Cyrus. So there you go.
Yeah.
Nebuchadnezzar ransacks Jerusalem and takes away the best, the youngest, the brightest back to Babylon.
And before he even did that, it says he placed the treasure that he had taken in the treasure house of his God.
Yeah.
And immediately when I read that, you can think this probably is not going to turn out well.
Well,
when you steal from God. And then not only that you stole from God, or I won't use that term that he stole from it, just the fact that he placed it with the other God was the issue.
Yeah.
Right there. So there are lots that we're going to get to later on that happens with this king as a result of him not humbling himself before God. We'll get to that later, but this is not a good starting point right here.
So a theme that you'll find, it comes up a couple different times in the book of Daniel, is that this verse or this phrase comes up, that God is the sovereign king over all the kings of the earth.
Yeah.
Right? So when you read that first verse and you go, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
It looks like God and his people got defeated.
Yeah.
This was God's plan. As a matter of fact, it said, what, in verse 2? Doesn't it say in verse 2? The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim.
Yeah.
So God did it. And then it says, and permitted him to take some of his sacred objects. So you were right. He didn't steal them.
Yeah.
God permitted it. But on the surface, it looks like a horrible defeat to, God himself. It doesn't turn out well, and we'll read about that later with regard to taking this stuff and putting it in a pagan god's temple. But let's talk about Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Most people would know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Yeah.
And they are selected. They're teenage boys. They're some of the brightest and sharpest young Israelite boys. And one of the things that Babylon would do, Nebuchadnezzar was really smart in this. He would come in, he would defeat, and it was a guaranteed defeat. When he was king, if Babylon came up against your kingdom, you were going to lose. So what he would do is it would be a very rapid, very quick strike, bring great defeat. He would select only the best and brightest, those who could provide great contributions to the nation of Babylon. And then he would leave everybody else who he didn't feel like were going to contribute that much. And they could take any land in the whole rest of the country now. You can live in any house. You can own any land, and as long as you're peaceful and keep paying taxes. Yeah. And so he had a lot of loyalty, even from the people he defeated. But the unique one is that he's bringing these young Israelite boys in to begin to learn, and Ashpenaz is assigned to have to train them.
Yeah. The one part that I think is funny there as you're talking about that, it says in verse 4, select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men. I thought that was actually funny.
Yeah, so the good news is we would have been picked for that probably, right, Wesley? Yeah. But yeah, that's what he was looking for, was the very best, the brightest, the ones that people would look up to. And then one of the best sentences, I think, in this chapter is in verse 8 when it says, but Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. Yeah. So, Babylon would have not had any real guidelines as to the kind of food they're supposed to eat, whereas the Israelites were raised with the law. Yeah. There are a whole bunch of things they should not eat for health purposes, for their religious purposes, to keep themselves clean. And Daniel, even though he's in a foreign land, mom and dad aren't looking over his shoulder. Yeah. Right? They're not making sure that he's being a good boy and that he's obeying all the religious rules. But he's so committed to his own faith. He's committed to God's ways that he decided to take a chance. Yeah. And it's a real risk to go, hey, the king gave us this food and we want to fit in. Yeah. We do, but we don't want to defile ourselves.
And just really quick, Jeff, what would you say to the person watching right now and they're in that position? It could be a work situation, it could be a family situation, and everyone else is doing that thing,
Yeah.
they know it's wrong, it's much easier to blend in than buck the system.
Oh, yeah.
What would you say to that person who's struggling with, I want to do the right thing, but I don't want to become the outcast?
Yeah. Well, I think it starts off, be determined like Daniel.
Yeah.
Daniel was determined not to defile himself. So he decided, whatever the consequences,
Yeah.
I'm not going to go down this path.
Just got to make a decision.
That's right.
Yeah.
But when you look at it, he's brilliant from a diplomatic standpoint.
Yeah,
He wasn't
he
a
is.
jerk. He wasn't, you guys are a bunch of pagans on your way to hell.
Yeah.
Rah, God's going to bring judgment, right? Which his nation had been conquered, and he's from one of the royal families.
Yeah.
So, he had a reason to have resentment, but he didn't. Instead, he was diplomatic. He understood the delicate circumstance that Ashpenaz found himself in, afraid he's going to lose his own head over something as simple as this.
Yeah.
But Nebuchadnezzar was ruthless. And so then he found favor from the attendant. And then he just offered a solution, a win-win. Hey, just test it for 10 days. Because, they have to learn the language. They have to learn the customs. This is a long training period. We read it in just a few verses, but it's going to be a long time. So he said, just give us 10 days. And I would say, if you can work hard to help the other person save face and at the same time be able to keep your purity, determined not to be defiled, right?
Yeah.
If you can do those two things, don't be judgmental. Instead, be diplomatic and say, let's try this. Would you let me try this thing? And then God bless them. Yeah. So I would say that those would be the two biggest things that we see in this first passage.
Yeah, I love the fact too of the attendant who was watching over them, and you talked about it great. But when they're talking about eating the food for 10 days, I kind of feel, in a sense, the attendant was more concerned about himself.
Oh, yeah.
So the concern was not really about the health of Daniel
No.
or the rest of them. He was more concerned about himself and what's going to happen to him.
Yeah.
But like you said, Daniel was very diplomatic in his response to him, and things worked out.
Well,
they were much healthier than the other people who were eating all of the great food and wine and all of that stuff.
Yeah, I think people in general in our society today lack a sense of diplomacy.
Yeah.
So
It's about winning and losing.
yeah, we think more about negotiation. Negotiation for most people is a win-lose kind of a thing, and I got to figure out how to get what I want. But diplomacy, if you can really learn diplomacy like Daniel here, what he's trying to figure out is, what does this guy need, and how can we come to an agreement where I can get what I need, but he's able to get what he needs? Yeah. And he knew that this guy was afraid of losing his head, and so he says, let's just try it for 10 days and see. And then, this is what's called the Daniel fast, when he goes, hey, no meat at all. No, just give us vegetables and give us water. He's making kind of a vegetable soup or whatever, and that's all we're going to have. I think you also have, maybe there's grief here. His kingdom has been lost, and he's in a foreign land. And he's also seeking God's wisdom and God's blessing. And so there is some advantage, some benefit for us to continue to think about the benefits of a fast. Because he was fasting all of the luxurious foods. Because not everything the king was offering was sinful or bad. But he decided, we're just going to go down to this very simple meal. We're going to seek God. And then it says in verse 17, God gave these four young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. Yeah. So they're grieving, they're fasting. They're also seeking God's protection and help during this time. So this wasn't just a pure diplomatic negotiation of win-win. It was also seeking God's blessing and favor during that short 10-day period. And then God's the one who stepped in and gave them phenomenal impact. And then from this point on, you see Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stewarding this gift from God so well, because I think they knew it wasn't from them.
Yeah, and they become like the go-to people.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So it's just incredible. What's the big thing that you feel like you want people to take away from our conversation today?
Yeah, I would say one of the big things is kind of like Daniel did, to be determined to make the godly choice. I'm careful not to say make the right choice, because when you use the word right choice, that can be open to interpretation.
It's subjective, right?
But be determined like Daniel in whatever situation that you're in right now. I know there's someone watching. You could be in a tough situation right now. You don't know which way to go, to the left or to the right. But be determined like Daniel to make the godly decision in that decision, even if short term it makes you an outcast.
Yeah. I think that's brilliant. I have a friend who wrote a book, Rocco DePiece. He wrote a book called Thriving in Babylon.
Yeah.
And he wrote it from the perspective of, so many times godly people feel like they're perpetually surrounded, maybe at work or in their life, surrounded, even captured by the godless nations or the godless people around them. And yet we see these young men thrive. Yeah. They move to the very top. They thrive while honoring God and finding diplomatic ways to move forward in the kingdom. And it required, first of all, that they determine not to defile themselves. And so you can thrive. That's what I want people to take home or take away today. You can thrive in Babylon when you choose to go God's way and do things God's way. So that's great. Well, that's what we're talking about today on HC Daily. We're so glad you joined us. Join us again tomorrow as we continue with the talk about Daniel.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us spread the word by liking this episode and sharing it on your social media platforms. Be sure to leave a comment and review, and don't forget to give us 5 stars. When you do, you help us reach even more people who need a daily devotional like HC Daily. If you'd like to hear more from Chris and Jeff, they're both teaching pastors at Heritage Church, located in Southeast Michigan. You can get more of their messages by clicking on the Messages tab at heritagechurch.com. Be sure to join us again soon for another episode of HC Daily.